Some new data from Abacus Data, new polling, finding that 16% of Canadians are watching these hearings closely, with 50% saying they're watching it a little and 34% say they haven't watched it at all. The majority of those surveyed think the government made the best choice it could at 63% by invoking the Emergencies Act, while 37% say it was a bad choice. Well, the Power Panel is here to discuss what happened this week. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. He's not in Manitoba or Winnipeg, he's in Vancouver. And in studio with me, journalist and author Paul Wells, Le Devoir's Marie Vastel, and the CBC's John Paul Tasker. Happy Friday, gang. Good to see you all again.
Hi. Hey, David.
Nigan, let's start with you. I can't really turn around to look at you, but I'm going to look at the camera here. A majority of people nationally say they think the federal government made the best choice. Based on what you've heard and what we saw, does that surprise you, those kinds of numbers?
Well, I mean, certainly the momentum is not on the side of the so-called Freedom Convoy. It's been a disaster of a week, and it's been a disaster of a few months. It really started with Pat King and James Botter's horrendously terrible presentations and selfishness that they've demonstrated throughout their testimonies, even going so far to say, 10 days of honking, like, really, should you be complaining about that? Downtown Ottawa. We actually had that in Winnipeg as well. But it's just been a real disastrous public relations nightmare for the Freedom Convoy protesters. And they certainly haven't handled it particularly well. We saw a little bit of an improvement with Tamara Leach's presentation, in that she's really showing a sort of selective memory. She's clearly been coached to say, don't fall on the side of the others. But what you're really seeing is a real fracturing of the leadership within the Freedom Convoy, that they're beginning to turn on each other, and they're turning on each other for the most part because they really see the writing on the wall, in that they're going to be held accountable for this. And there's also talk of a civil suit. And of course, there's the issue of the police leaks, that there's going to be much bigger than this. And we're going to show that there's Freedom Convoy support that goes not just within the protesters, but also within institutions in Ottawa and beyond.
Okay, so Nigan is clearly in the 16% of Canadians who are watching it closely with that level of analysis. But Maria, I just wonder, to touch on the point that the portrait we saw of the infighting, the disorganization, and really the lack of functional control over the protesters by the people who were self-described as the leadership. What's your assessment of what we learned this week?
I mean, lack of control. I think they were being followed closely, despite what Ms. Leach is saying. She might want to say now that she's at an inquiry and that she has an upcoming trial that she doesn't have that much influence, but clearly people were following their social media, were following what they were saying. I think it was a bad week last week, or the week before, I've lost track, for police. I think it's not a great week this week for convoy organizers. Nigan's right that we're sort of seeing them turn on each other. We're also seeing them have very evasive answers, and to the poll that you were pointing to, I don't think this is going to change people's minds much. I think that poll was showing that people's minds are made up, whether it was a good or a bad decision. What I found interesting in that poll was also the breakdown of voters per party who think it's a bad or a good decision. So not surprisingly, Liberal voters, 83% of them think it was the best choice. 68% of NDP voters thought it was the best choice. But surprisingly or not, I don't know, to me it was surprising, Conservative voters are smack split in the middle.
I was surprised at how many Conservative voters
of 46%
supported it. 40%
thinks it was the best choice, was just essentially half. I think that doesn't spell very good news for Pierre Poilievre. I know the inquiry's goal is to see if legally the emergency act should have been invoked, but politically, it's not really going in Mr. Poilievre's favor if even his party is not convinced that he should have supported the truckers, or that the truckers' protest was legitimate at the very least. People in his own party don't seem convinced that his position, thinking it was a legitimate occupation, his party members don't seem to be majorly behind him on that.
No, I just said whether the act was necessary. It's actually about whether it was appropriate.
Yes.
I want to use the correct term, as people have corrected me on that, and trust me, I've heard you. But Paul, one thing we know is not appropriate is for police officers to be leaking operational details to protesters who are occupying the national capital. And there's a lot of evidence this week that the convoy was getting stuff from the RCMP, from Ottawa Police Service. There's an investigation happening now. An OPS member maybe was suspended because of this. This is not good for public confidence in police to have this kind of revelation coming out. I mean, what does all of that tell us?
I think different accounts are worrisome to different degrees. Sending out information about the Prime Minister's whereabouts is really hard to feel blasé about. In a year when several world leaders have been shot, including a former prime minister of Japan. Even the convoy lawyer was quoting a bit of information that's been going out lately that, say hypothetically, 80% of the convoy were law-abiding and 15% were on the fence and 5% were active troublemakers. I don't know where that number came from. I'm willing to believe it. 5% of a very large number is a pretty large number.
530 charges, right?
And you can bet that every bit of risk assessment was landing on the Prime Minister's desk, which might help explain some of his reaction to this thing. Culturally, though, I'd be astonished if OPP officers who come from small towns, live on highways, and camp and eat in the same places that the convoy protesters camp and eat, if some of them were not essentially pals or palsy-walsy with some of the protesters. I'd be astonished if that were not the case. And some of the police liaison teams had as their job to share information with the protesters.
Right. JP, what's your sense of where we are now, 2 weeks and a bit into this?
Yeah, well, I think has been mentioned, I think in the court of public opinion, the Emergencies Act was the right thing to do. But as a matter of law, I think it's still an open question. I was speaking to someone in government today. They're happy with this week. They thought it was great to have Jeremy McKenzie, the leader of Dagalon, testifying from prison today. I think it just kind of drives home the message that these are unsavory characters and that it maybe was appropriate to bring down the hammer. But one thing I was struck by yesterday was to talk about the financing. And, we finally got some details on just how much money was raised, and it was an eye-popping number. I think $34 million was actually hauled in by these people. Most of it, though, coming from Canada, which was not the narrative that the government floated at the time when they said they were going to invoke the Emergencies Act. And most of it was frozen by provincial injunction and also by the injunction related to the lawsuit because of the downtown
But
Ottawa
half of the
residents.
donations from Give Send Go came from the United
They
States,
did.
right? So
They
that
did.
was an interesting thing.
It was
Millions of
50-50 on
dollars.
that platform, but all the e-transfers were from Canada, and the other platform, GoFundMe, was the vast majority of it was from
about
Canada.
86% of it.
So, but I think that's interesting, though. They didn't need the Emergencies Act to stop the flow of funds to these convoy organizers. They already had provincial legislation. They had the injunction in court. And so that was really the tool that was most effective. Those tools were most effective at stopping the flow of funds. So I'm not saying it was the wrong thing to do in terms of invoking the Emergencies Act to stop some of the personal money, because we know the EA was effective in actually stopping Tamara Lich from accessing her personal bank account. And the same with Chris Barber, the Saskatchewan trucker. He got caught up in all that. So I'm not saying it wasn't effective, but there are questions about whether it was necessary. And I take your point that that's not what this is all about. It isn't whether it was necessary, but there were things available to them to actually stop, to cut this all off.
Right, and two quick things just to clarify. To be fair to Mr. McKenzie, who testified today from a jail cell in Saskatchewan, that is on charges unrelated to what is happening at the convoy. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, e-transfers, that's a Canadian thing only, right? So that there could be no foreign money.
No, but there was a substantial sum of money came through e-transfers directly into their bank account.
A lot of domestic support. Nigam, one just quick question. I was struck by something Paul Champ, who represents businesses and citizens of the downtown core, brought up when he got kind of frustrated when he was cross-examining Pat King, and he said to the judge, the people of Ottawa got a morning. They got like a half a day and then another half a day for businesses, and it's a full week, for the convoy organizers, and as he said, to say whatever they want up here, because there's some things said. I mean, should we have heard more from people who live in Ottawa or were directly affected by this financially?
I think one of the most ironic moments of this entire commission was when Pat King was bemoaning the loss of his freedoms while freely being able to have hours on national television to share his views as much as he wants. And so that's pretty much where we are at in terms of the treatment of the convoy protest organizers. But then, thinking back to the small amount of time that Ottawa citizens received, like everyday taxpayers and Ottawa citizens are enduring months and months and months of suffering for this. Taxpayers are paying for health and justice costs. Those in the downtown are still suffering from nightmares and trauma from the assaults and attacks, verbally, in some cases, being harassed by going simply to work. And then, of course, the Ottawa businesses downtown lost $1 million a day. Yeah. I mean, there's a long-standing impact of this. But I just want to add one more thing, really.
Quickly, because we got to take a break.
What the Commission's job is to do is to really assess was the use of the Emergencies Act appropriate? And I think that the civic governments left it so long that it might have been the only choice of the federal government. I really want that to be tested through this.
Yeah, appropriate or not, it felt like everything made it inevitable. What's also inevitable is a commercial break. I got to take a quick break, but stay tuned. More Power and Politics coming up right after this.
The final stretch. The inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act has so far heard from 61 witnesses, and now it's entering its last week of testimonies. On the docket, 8 cabinet ministers, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The commission will also hear from Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and 6 other prominent cabinet ministers. When the act was invoked in February, Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino said police asked for the legislation. But in testimony over the past 5 weeks, different levels of law enforcement have said the additional powers were not needed to end the anti-government protests that gridlocked downtown Ottawa. And more recently, we also heard that CSIS did not believe the convoy protest posed a national security threat under the law. The inquiry is looking into whether the federal government was justified in invoking the act, in which cabinet must have reasonable grounds to believe a public order emergency exists. So, are Canadians paying attention to the inquiry, and what will the political fallout and legacy of this commission be once it wraps up? The Scrum is here to answer that. Stephanie Levitz is a Parliament Hill Star reporter for the Toronto Star. John Ivison is the Ottawa Bureau Chief at Post Media and a columnist with the National Post. And our special guest this round is our own Nick Nanos of Nanos Research. Good morning to the three of you. Good to have you in studio. Still not completely used to that. Nick, there have been 5 weeks of testimony, and you know, it's been a bit of a marathon here. We've been following it in the bubble. We're completely, you know, some of us obsessed with it, I could say. Are Canadians interested and paying attention?
Well, they are interested in paying attention. I think we should parse out, maybe should I call it the goat rodeo, known as how Canada has responded or how Ottawa has responded to the truckers' convoy, and then the convoy itself. What's interesting is that when we survey Canadians on behalf of CTV News, about 2 out of every 3 believe that it was necessary or somewhat necessary to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. So I think for average Canadians, they know that it was a mess, but that they connect the Emergency Powers Act with the end of the convoy.
So, you know, in the end, invoking the Emergencies Act, Stephanie, is a political decision. So we're set to hear from cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister. So what question do they need to answer? What do you want to hear from them?
I want to hear what I think we've all wanted to hear from them from the beginning, right? Which is, what is the information that you based your decision on to invoke this historically never used before piece of legislation? And if we've heard anything from the last 5 weeks of testimony, I'm not even sure we have the answer to that question yet. Because you see that there are pieces of information coming from all different directions. No one was really knitting them together in what seemed like a coherent way to present to the federal cabinet and say, upon this, thou shalt make this decision. So what did they make the decision? What was the ultimate thing that was put before cabinet and they said, yes, this, we must do this? That's what I think Canadians need to hear, that piece of accountability.
So, you know, going on what Stephanie just said, the Prime Minister will testify this coming week. So what's riding on? How important is that testimony?
Well, I don't think it's that important politically. I mean, I think we've already seen the NDP has given the government a free pass. They've said they're not going to bring them down over whatever the judge rules. And I think, you know, we're probably going to hear from Justice Rouleau in February. We're probably not going to have an election for another year after that. It's probably going to be well in the rear view mirror by the time that an election comes around. And I think Canadians have already made their mind up. As Nick said, you know, most of them have already decided, whatever the judge says, that this was something that was required. On the other hand, I think from what we've heard so far over 5 weeks, the legal case has not been made. And that, after all, is what this inquiry is all about, is did the government's actions meet the threshold of the Emergencies Act, which is that there was a threat to national security that could not be handled by any other laws. And from what we've heard over 5 weeks, the government didn't meet the bar.
So they didn't make a practical, a legal argument is not made, but a practical one seems to have been made, because once the act was invoked, Nick, it happened.
People saw things happen.
Exactly. So what could be the political fallout for the Prime Minister?
Okay, I think it's going to be very different than what we've just talked about right now, because I think the big question is will Justin Trudeau stay on as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada? And what role will his testimony, whether he enjoys it or doesn't enjoy it, or whether it's a good or bad day for him, what role it might play in his personal calculus on his political future? Because the fact of the matter is he has been Prime Minister since 2015. Most people have firm opinions. They're not going to change their opinions based on anything that's said or not said when he testifies. But I'm going to be looking towards his demeanor and kind of attitude towards this as to whether it's someone that is looking to curry favor and run for re-election in 2025, or someone that might be a little crusty, why don't we say, as he kind of engages in this, because he really doesn't care.
So, Stephanie, you know, what will be the legacy of the commission? I mean, this is a first in Canada. We're watching this and seeing, was there an abuse? Were they right or were they wrong? What will be the legacy of this commission?
Well, one will be to see if they change the legislation as a result, right? If we've used this legislation for the first time, and you know, as John so accurately pointed out, it was, you know, some of the testimony is that, well, the legislation was a little too narrow and it didn't quite do this, and so does it need to be changed? Do there need to be additional thresholds built into the law so that we don't end up with, you know, what looked like a total goat rodeo of decision making going in
Sorry
to
for
invoking
introducing
it?
goats in the discussion.
You put it into my head and it's still there. I think that could be the legacy. I mean, if anything else, though, I think that the legacy is accountability. Never before have we seen in recent memory a government decision unpacked like this. Yeah. Every email, every text message, every little Zoom chat, it's all there. And I think for the public to be able to really get behind the curtain and see what goes into making these huge decisions that get made on behalf of the Canadian people, this is really important. And I hope that the public takes it and keeps pressing for that kind of transparency.
But it's an ugly curtain, I'd just like to add.
Well, I do think that might be a deterrent in itself, that future governments are going to think twice about using it because they don't want this to happen. Just one thing on the legacy, I do think that Justice Rollo's recommendations are going to be crucial, because the biggest takeaway for most people is that there was complete dysfunction between police services and between levels of government. And, you know, God forbid we have a real emergency. I mean, I think this was a public order crisis, but it may not have been an emergency. But if we have a real emergency and we have the same response from governments and police forces, we'll be in real trouble.
Are people judging the politicians, or in your surveys, are people also judging the inaction of the police forces?
Well, I think they're judging, when it comes to the Emergency Act, the outcome, which is why they're okay with that. But I think they also recognize that it was a hot mess from the very beginning to the end. And invoking the Emergency Act is sending a signal to the Truckers' Freedom Convoy that action is going to happen and that it's serious. So that was the first step in the solution.
Nick Nanos, thanks for joining us. Stephanie and John will stay with us.